Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 7, John Locke. Our topic of discussion is social contract and civil society. When drives man into society, according to Locke, is that God put them under strong obligations of necessity, convenience, and inclination. Political power is a right of making laws with penalties of death and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property and of employing the force of the community. In the execution of such laws and in the defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good, and man being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to political power of another without his own consent. Therefore, the problem is to form civil society by common consent of all men and transfer their rights of punishing the violators of natural law to an independent and impartial authority. For all practical purposes, after the formation of civil society, this common consent becomes the consent of the majority. All parties must submit to the determination of the majority, which carries the force of the community, for that is the only way of political action. So, all men unanimously agree to incorporate themselves in one body and conduct their affairs by the opinion of the majority. After they have set up a political or civil society, the next step is to appoint a government or legislative to declare and execute the natural law. This law calls the supreme authority established by the Commonwealth or civil society. Here we have two separate acts, one by which the civil society is established and the other which creates the government, while the first is the product of a contract and the second is only a federality power to act for certain ends. And there remains is still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust responded in them. The relationship between society and government is expressed by the idea of trust because it observes making the government a party to the contract and giving it an independent status and authority. Professor Ernest Barker and J.W. Goh have placed great emphasis on the technical implication of the trust theory, which makes the community both the trusted and the beneficiary, having no duties as regards the trustee, that is, the government last let. On the other hand, interprets it in a non-legal sense, intended to make it clear that all actions of governors are limited to the end of government, which is the good of the governed, and to demonstrate by contrast that there is no contract in it. That is all. Besides the legislative, which is the supreme authority, Locke mentions two other power of Commonwealth, the executive and the federative. The federative power of the government is concerned with what we now call foreign affairs, what Montesquieu later on called the judicial power is included in the executive. The executive power is subordinate to the legislative and is responsible to it. Though the legislative is the supreme power, it is not arbitrary. It exists for common good, which is the preservation of freedom and protection of property. The law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, legislators as well as others. The rules that they make for other men's action must be conformable to the law of nature, that is, to the will of God, of which that is a declaration, and the fundamental law of nature being the preservation of mankind. No human section can be good or valid against it. Secondly, the legislative or the supreme authority cannot rule by extemporary arbitrary decrees, but only by duly promulgated and established laws. Thirdly, the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his consent. And lastly, the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands, or for it being but a delegated power from the people. They who have it cannot pass it over to others. The above restrictions on the supreme authority of the legislative body has tended to obscure Locke's view of sovereignty. C. E. Wagon has categorically declared that the Locke had no theory of sovereignty at all. The true sovereign of civil government is the individual, and according to Ernest Barker, Locke had no clear view of the nature and residence of sovereignty. This is unfair to Locke. It is to identify the notion of sovereignty with only one of its variants. The Hobbesian Arstian's version, which conceives sovereignty in terms of the will of an absolute power. The other view, which regards sovereignty not as power but authority and an expression of the transcendent reason, natural law, or divine order, admits the limitations of a higher law on the power of the state without denying its competence and authority in relation to positive law. This is the tradition on which Locke was fed, and it is the bedrock of all constitutional governments. It harks back to St. Thomas Aquinas through Hooker and Bodin, and is represented by writers like Eliot Philip, Hunton, and Sir Matthew Hale in Locke's own time. Locke admits that behind the authority of the legislature there is an ultimate sovereignty of people, which later writers termed as popular sovereignty, and thus the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempt and designs of anybody, even of their legislatures, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay or carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. But the communities exercises this power not as considered under any term form of government, because this power of the people can never take place till the government be dissolved, and in all cases while the government subsists, the legislative is the supreme power. The doctrine of popular or national sovereignty cannot be properly ascribed to Locke. The ultimate source of all authority in his theory is the law of nature, but sovereignty in the technical sense resides only in the law making body. This legislative is not only the supreme power of the Commonwealth, but sacred and unalterable in the hand where the community have once placed it, nor can the edict of any one else, in whatsoever form conceived or by what power soever backed, have the fury and obligation of a law which has not its sanction from the legislative, which the public has chosen and appointed, and therefore all the obedience which by the most solemn ties anyone can be obliged to pay ultimately termines in the supreme power. In a penetrating criticism of Locke, George H. Sabine points out four levels of authority in two treatises, the last three being represented as successively deviated from the first. But Locke seems to attribute a kind of absoluteness to each of the four. First, there is the individual and his rights, the foundation of the whole system. Secondly, there is the community, the custodian of individual right and the authority standing behind the government. Thirdly, there is the government or the legislative, which is constitutionally the supreme power. And finally, we have the executive or the king, which also enjoys some kind of independent status and discretionary power while remaining subservient to the legislative or parliament. This, however, far from being a criticism, may be taken as the commendations. Locke was fully conscious of the complexity of political system, and he was attempting to present a phenomenology of political institutions without adopting a reductionist methodology which seeks to explain all things in terms of a single ultimate entity, irreducible social atoms or abstract entity like the community or people. He was neither a pure nominist nor a perfect realist. Being a conceptualist, he is nearer to Aristotle than either to Plato or to the Protagoras or the Sophists. His state is not a fictitious corporation like that of Hobbes, but it is also not Hegel's concrete universal. Locke wants to maintain balance and harmony among the different organs of government under the supreme majesty of natural law. Now we want to wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.